History does not always begin where we think it does. Sometimes it opens with a quiet absence, a space where memory thins and certainty dissolves. In the oldest Sumerian texts, certain things appear without surprise, as if they belong to a world already mature, already instructed. Cities rise fully formed. Knowledge arrives without childhood. Time itself seems practiced. What, then, came before the first page we still possess? Tonight, there is no need to answer, only to slow the breath, follow the faint traces left in clay and silence, and step gently into a longer journey of wondering. Something in the earliest Sumerian records feels unfinished, not in the sense of being primitive, but in the way a story feels incomplete when its first chapters have been torn away. When archaeologists first translated the clay tablets from cities like Uruk and Eridu, they expected clumsiness, the hesitations of a civilization learning to speak. Instead, they encountered confidence. Administrative systems already refined, religious cosmologies already layered, mathematical structures already abstract. Writing itself appears not as an experiment, but as a tool already aware of its own power. The strangeness lies not in what these texts say, but in what they assume needs no explanation. The lists of kings stretch backward far beyond what modern timelines comfortably allow. Reigns lasting tens of thousands of years are recorded without apology, as if duration itself once obeyed a different logic. The scribes do not pause to justify these numbers. They do not frame them as metaphor. They write as accountants of memory, not poets inventing myth. And in this casual certainty an unease quietly forms, because exaggeration usually announces itself. Here, it does not. The tablets simply continue, line after line, as if expecting the reader to already understand. Even the cities themselves seem to arrive too suddenly. Uruk, one of the first true urban centres, does not emerge gradually in the archaeological record. It appears dense, organised, engineered. Walls, temples, administrative quarters, specialised labour. Such complexity usually demands generations of trial and failure, yet the evidence suggests acceleration rather than slow ascent. It is as though a template had been followed, rather than invented from scratch. The clay bricks are silent on this point, but the silence feels deliberate, like a curtain drawn. The Sumerians themselves hinted at an earlier time, though never in direct confession. Their myths speak of a world before kingship descended from heaven, before the flood reshaped the land, before humans were burdened with labour and time. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic, yet symbolism usually exaggerates human concerns. What is odd here is how restrained these accounts are. They read less like fantasies and more like memories filtered through ritual language. Events occur, decisions are made, consequences follow. There is little moral instruction, little insistence on belief, only sequence. Among the most unsettling elements is how knowledge is distributed in these texts. Astronomy appears with precision, mapping cycles of Venus and the Moon with an accuracy that implies long observation. Mathematics operates in base 60, a system elegant enough to persist into modern measurements of time and angle. Medicine blends ritual with empirical detail. Law codes assume social complexity already stabilized. None of this is introduced as innovation. It is treated as inheritance. The tone suggests continuity, not discovery. Inheritance implies predecessors. Yet when one searches for them, the trail fades. Earlier layers exist, but they do not fully account for the leap. Something seems to have been lost between the ground and the tablet, between experience and inscription. Erosion, floods, and time explain part of it, but not all. Other civilizations show gradual refinement in their material culture. Here, refinement precedes expectation. The imbalance remains. The flood narratives deepen this discomfort. Long before similar stories appear elsewhere, Sumerian texts describe a world reset by overwhelming waters. The details vary, but the structure remains consistent. Warning, preservation, destruction, survival, renewal. Geological studies confirm that massive flooding did occur in Mesopotamia at the end of the last ice age, when meltwater reshaped river systems and coastlines. The question is not whether floods happened, but whether memory of them survived intact across generations capable of writing them down. If these stories are echoes of real events, then the scribes were not inventing origins, but recording aftermaths. Writing becomes not a birth, but a recovery. Civilization, in this view, is not a first attempt, but a restart. This would explain the quiet competence embedded in the earliest records. One does not struggle to remember skills that were never forgotten, only interrupted. Yet there is another possibility, more unsettling still. Knowledge in Sumer does not always appear evenly distributed. Certain figures, divine or semi-divine, are portrayed as bearers of instruction. They bring laws, measurements, rituals, and arts. They are not creators, but transmitters. The texts do not dwell on their origins, only their function. They arrive, teach, depart. Whether these figures are symbolic, mythologized leaders, or something else entirely is left unresolved. The ambiguity itself feels intentional. Over time, later cultures inherited fragments of these accounts, reshaping them to fit new frameworks. The gods became allegory. The long rains became metaphor. The flood became moral lesson. In each retelling, certainty softened into story. But the earliest layers resist this softening. They are too dry, too procedural, too unconcerned with persuasion. They were not written to convince, only to remember. Memory, however, is fragile. Clay survives where flesh does not, but even clay fractures. Entire libraries were burned, buried, dissolved. What remains may not represent the beginning at all, only the point at which recording resumed. This possibility shifts the emotional weight of the tablets. They no longer announce humanity's first words, but its attempt to speak again after silence. If so, then early history is not missing details by accident. It is missing them because something intervened, a natural catastrophe, a slow collapse, a deliberate erasure. Each option carries different implications, yet all lead to the same unease. The line we call the dawn of civilization may actually be a scar, marking not emergence, but survival. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this fragility. Their texts are haunted by loss, cities fall, knowledge must be preserved, names must be written, lest they vanish. There is urgency beneath the calm, a quiet insistence that forgetting is the true enemy. Writing becomes an act of resistance against disappearance, not a celebration of novelty. And so, from the very first marks pressed into wet clay, a question lingers without being spoken. Not who we were becoming, but who we had already been. Not how civilization began, but why it had to begin again. The tablets do not answer. They do not argue. They simply continue, as if trusting that one day someone would notice the gap they were never meant to fill. What becomes unsettling, once the eye adjusts to the confidence of the earliest tablets, is not merely what they contain, but what they ignore. Entire categories of knowledge appear without origin stories. Techniques exist without experimentation. Systems function without recorded debate. In most early civilizations, learning leaves fingerprints, errors, revisions, abandoned paths. In Sumer, those traces are strangely faint. The record begins after uncertainty has already been resolved. The scribes who pressed reeds into clay did not write like pioneers. They wrote like custodians. Their concern was accuracy, continuity, preservation. They catalogued grain, land, stars, rituals and names with the quiet precision of those maintaining something inherited. There is no excitement of discovery in their tone, no emphasis on novelty. The mood is administrative, almost weary, as if the task was not to invent a world, but to keep one from slipping away again. Consider the precision with which time itself is treated. The Sumerian calendar is not tentative. It is aligned with lunar cycles, intercalated with mathematical care, adjusted for seasonal drift. This requires generations of observation, yet it appears at the threshold of writing. Venus cycles are recorded with a patience that suggests institutional memory longer than a single lifetime. Such patience implies continuity. Observers trained by observers before them, extending backward beyond the horizon of the tablets. Language, too, arrives already burdened with depth. Sumerian is not a simple tongue. Its grammar is layered, its vocabulary abstract, capable of expressing legal nuance, theological subtlety, and poetic ambiguity. Linguistic evolution usually leaves behind simpler ancestors. Here, the ancestors are missing. The language enters history already capable of describing a complex world. One does not easily explain this by sudden inspiration alone. Even architecture reflects this quiet maturity. Temples are aligned with celestial considerations. Urban layouts follow symbolic logic as well as practical need. Construction techniques show standardization, implying shared knowledge and training. These are not experiments frozen in clay and brick. They are the products of familiarity. A culture comfortable with its tools rarely pauses to explain them. What deepens the sense of absence is how rarely Sumerian texts dwell on beginnings. They speak of maintenance, restoration, rebuilding. Floods damage temples, and temples are rebuilt according to established forms. Kings restore ancient rites rather than invent new ones. Authority derives from alignment with what came before, not from innovation. Power, in this worldview, flows backward, not forward. This backward orientation shapes their understanding of humanity itself. Humans are not portrayed as ascending heroes, but as caretakers placed into a world already structured. Labour is assigned, boundaries are drawn, duties are inherited. Even the gods are often bound by older rules, older destinies. Creation, when mentioned, feels secondary to order. The universe seems less like a newborn and more like a system recovering balance. Such a worldview raises uncomfortable implications. If order precedes humanity, then humanity did not design the system it inhabits. If knowledge is inherited, then someone else once carried it. The texts never clarify who that someone was. They simply move on, uninterested in satisfying later curiosity. The absence feels intentional, not accidental. Some scholars have suggested that oral traditions once filled this gap, later lost when catastrophe severed continuity. Others point to geological disruptions, abrupt climate shifts that would have erased settlements and populations while leaving fragments of memory intact. The end of the last ice age was not gentle in Mesopotamia. Rivers changed course, coastlines vanished. Fertile land flooded and dried again. Survival would have demanded adaptation, not documentation. Yet adaptation alone does not explain why recovered knowledge appears so coherent. Trauma usually fragments culture. What emerges here feels curated, as though certain elements were preserved deliberately while others were allowed to dissolve. Writing itself may have been part of this preservation effort, a technology deployed precisely because memory had proven unreliable. There is also the matter of what was chosen to be recorded. The tablets prioritize systems over stories, function over emotion. They preserve measurements, transactions, omens, and rituals. Personal voices are rare. This selectivity suggests urgency. When time is short, one saves what seems essential. The rest is entrusted to silence. Silence, however, is not emptiness. It shapes interpretation as powerfully as text. Later civilizations would fill these silences with gods, legends, moral frameworks, but the earlier Sumerian layers resist embellishment. They remain stark, procedural, uninterested in guiding belief. Their restraint feels almost modern, unsettlingly so. As centuries passed, this restraint softened. Myths grew richer. Gods became personalities. History blurred into narrative. Yet beneath these later layers, the earlier tone persists like a buried foundation. Calm, methodical, unexplained. It does not seek followers. It does not ask to be believed. It simply exists, patient and unmoved. If early history feels incomplete, it may be because it was never meant to explain itself. The tablets were not written for distant descendants. They were written for continuity, for those who already knew the rules but needed reminders. Their audience was not the future, but the fragile present of their own time. This perspective alters how absence is understood. What is missing may not have been lost accidentally, but deemed unnecessary to record. Origins, after all, matter less when survival depends on stability. One looks backward only far enough to maintain balance. Beyond that lies distraction, and yet for those who encounter these texts now, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. It presses gently, persistently, not demanding answers, but unsettling assumptions. Civilization no longer appears as a linear ascent, but as a careful reconstruction built atop something older, quieter, and mostly unseen. The Sumerian record does not announce this reconstruction. It does not dramatize recovery. It simply proceeds, line by line, as if stepping across a gap without comment. The gap remains, unmarked, waiting. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder that history, like memory, often resumes without explaining what interrupted it. As the Sumerian record unfolds further, a subtle pattern begins to emerge. one that does not announce itself but slowly shapes the emotional gravity of the texts. Knowledge is rarely portrayed as something discovered. Instead, it is received, guarded, sometimes misplaced, and occasionally restored. The idea that wisdom can be lost feels deeply embedded, as though forgetting were an ever-present threat rather than a distant abstraction. This tone casts early civilization not as a dawn, but as a vigil held through the night. Central to this feeling is the recurring emphasis on preservation. Sacred objects are hidden, sealed, or entrusted to specific hands. Rituals are described with exact repetition, as if deviation itself carries risk. Even language reflects this caution. Words are chosen carefully, formulas repeated precisely. Innovation is not celebrated. Fidelity is. To remain aligned with what was already established seems more important than to create something new. The concept of divine instruction plays a crucial role here, though it is presented with unusual restraint. Certain beings are said to have delivered laws, measurements, and rites, then withdrawn. They are not depicted as rulers demanding worship, but as sources of calibration, setting standards that must be maintained. Their authority lies not in command, but in precedent. Once again, the texts offer function without origin. Instruction arrives fully formed, and its source recedes into quiet distance. This framing alters the emotional relationship between humans and knowledge. Learning becomes an act of remembering rather than discovering. Error is framed as forgetting rather than ignorance. The danger is not curiosity, but drift. This worldview suggests a past in which knowledge once circulated freely, later becoming fragile, needing protection from time, chaos, and human neglect. Such a mindset aligns uneasily well with the environmental reality of ancient Mesopotamia. The land was fertile but volatile. Rivers nourished and destroyed with equal indifference. Cities depended on constant maintenance of canals and levees. Neglect meant collapse. Survival required attentiveness, continuity, and respect for inherited systems. In this context, the fear of forgetting was not philosophical, it was practical. Yet environmental pressure alone does not explain the depth of historical awareness embedded in the texts. There is a persistent sense that the present stands on the edge of something already broken once before. Floods are not treated as rare anomalies, but as recurring corrections. The world is repeatedly undone and repaired. Civilization persists not because it advances, but because it adapts to loss. This cyclical sensibility contrasts sharply with later narratives of linear progress. In Sumerian thought, time does not march forward confidently. It loops, erodes, resets. Kings rise and fall. Cities flourish and vanish. Even the gods are bound to cosmic cycles. Permanence is not expected. Only continuity of pattern is hoped for. Within this framework, writing itself takes on a different meaning. It is not a celebration of permanence, but an acknowledgement of impermanence. Clay tablets are created precisely because memory cannot be trusted. What is written is not what is new, but what is at risk of disappearing. Writing becomes an act of humility before time. This humility is echoed in how authority is portrayed. Kings are custodians, not originators. Their legitimacy depends on restoring temples, reviving rites, maintaining boundaries established long before their reigns. Power is measured by alignment with the past, not dominance over the future. Even conquest is framed as correction rather than expansion. Over generations, as memory thinned and distance from earlier disruptions grew, later cultures inherited these patterns without fully understanding their origin. The caution remained, but its source faded. Myths filled the gaps, gods multiplied, explanations grew more elaborate. Yet beneath the ornamentation, the original structure persisted, quietly shaping belief. Modern readers, accustomed to narratives of steady ascent, often misinterpret this structure. Long reigns are dismissed as fantasy, divine instructors are labelled metaphor, cycles are flattened into allegory. These interpretations may be partially valid, yet they risk missing the emotional truth embedded in the texts. The Sumerians were not attempting to impress posterity, they were attempting to endure. Endurance, however, leaves traces different from ambition. It produces systems rather than stories, procedures rather than proclamations. It favours repetition over novelty. When catastrophe has already occurred once, survival depends on minimising deviation. Creativity becomes secondary to stability. This perspective casts the earlier civilization in a gentler, more vulnerable light. Instead of bold pioneers stepping into the unknown, we see careful stewards tending a fragile inheritance. Their world feels older than it should, not because they imagined it so, but because they sensed its weight pressing down upon them. The unsettling implication is that what modern history calls the beginning may actually be a midpoint, a moment of reassembly rather than origin. The tablets do not say this outright. They do not need to. Their tone carries the suggestion quietly, like a memory half remembered, never fully articulated. As these records pass through centuries, copied and recopied, something else becomes clear. The anxiety of loss never fully disappears. Even at the height of Sumerian complexity, there is no confidence that stability will last. Every restoration assumes a future collapse. Every preservation effort acknowledges its own insufficiency. And so the clay tablets endure as both evidence and warning. Evidence that knowledge once flowed from a depth no longer accessible. Warning that continuity is fragile, easily broken, difficult to restore. They do not teach optimism, they teach attentiveness. In this attentiveness lies the deeper mystery. Why does early civilization speak with the voice of something already weathered? Why does it remember loss more vividly than birth? The texts do not resolve this tension. They simply hold it quietly, inviting those who read them to sit with the discomfort of an origin that feels strangely like an echo. As the layers of Sumerian thought settle into place, another quiet anomaly begins to surface, one that hides not in myth but in measurement. The earliest texts do not simply describe the world, they quantify it with remarkable assurance. Distances, weights, angles, durations, all are handled with systems that feel disproportionate to their supposed age. Measurement here is not tentative. It is confident, abstract, and already standardized. The sexagesimal system, based on 60, appears fully operational from the start. It is flexible, divisible, and capable of expressing both the practical and the cosmic. Time is segmented. Space is ordered. The movement of celestial bodies is rendered into countable cycles. Such a system is not intuitive. It is learned, refined, tested. Yet the tablets do not preserve that testing. They preserve only the finished structure. What makes this more unsettling is how seamlessly mathematics merges with cosmology. Numbers are not neutral tools. They are woven into the understanding of reality itself. The heavens move according to countable rhythms. Rituals follow numerical patterns. Even divine realms are structured mathematically. This suggests not only observation, but synthesis. Someone, at some point, unified sky, earth, and number into a coherent worldview. Astronomical records deepen this impression. Venus cycles are tracked with consistency across generations. Lunar months are reconciled with solar years. Eclipses are anticipated. These are not the achievements of casual stargazing. They require long-term observation, record-keeping, and institutional continuity. The sky does not yield its patterns quickly. It demands patience measured in lifetimes. Yet the record offers no gradual climb toward this knowledge. There are no early miscalculations preserved, no discarded models, no visible path of refinement. The stars enter the written record already domesticated, already translated into order. This absence once again presses gently against expectation. Where did the mistakes go? Some have suggested that earlier observational traditions existed in forms that did not survive. Wood, reed, memory itself. This is plausible, yet incomplete. Even oral cultures leave traces of struggle in their early writing. Here, struggle is strangely muted. The cosmos appears less like a mystery being unravelled, and more like a system being maintained. Maintenance implies inheritance. It implies that the patterns were already known, already trusted. The task of the scribes was not to discover the sky, but to keep its rhythm aligned with human life. Calendars regulate agriculture. Omens guide decisions. Timekeeping ensures ritual continuity. These are acts of stewardship, not exploration. The same logic extends to geometry and construction. Right angles, proportional layouts, symbolic alignments. These appear not as innovations, but as norms. Buildings mirror cosmic order. Space is not neutral, it is encoded. The city becomes a reflection of a larger pattern, one that extends beyond human scale. Such integration of abstract thought and daily life suggests a civilization inheriting not fragments, but a framework. Frameworks are not easily assembled in chaos. They require coherence. The question then shifts subtly. Not how early humans invented these systems, but how they came to possess them in such a stable form. Geological memory offers a partial backdrop. The end of the last ice age reshaped the planet dramatically. Sea levels rose, coastlines vanished. Ancient settlements now lie submerged beneath shallow seas. Entire lifeways disappeared without leaving clay behind. It is possible that earlier centres of observation and learning existed in places now erased, their knowledge carried inland by survivors. If so, the Mesopotamian plain may not have been the birthplace of civilization, but its refuge, a place where displaced knowledge condensed and stabilized. This would explain both the sophistication of early systems and the anxiety surrounding preservation. Writing emerges not as a creative impulse, but as a defensive one. Defense against time, against water, against forgetting. Clay tablets are heavy, durable, and mundane. They are not ideal for storytelling, but excellent for survival. They fix numbers, names, procedures. They resist erosion of meaning even as cities crumble around them. In this light, the mathematical precision of the texts feels less like brilliance and more like necessity. There is also a notable absence of wonder in these astronomical records. The stars are not described with awe, but with familiarity. Their movements are expected, their irregularities catalogued. The emotional distance is striking. One does not marvel at what one has known for a long time. As centuries pass, later cultures would mythologize the sky, transforming planets into gods and stories. But beneath that myth, the older numerical skeleton remains. Time is still divided by 60. Angles still measured the same way. The inheritance persists long after its origin has been forgotten. This persistence is perhaps the most revealing clue. Cultural inventions often change rapidly. Inherited systems endure. The fact that modern civilization still uses remnants of Sumerian mathematics suggests not just ingenuity, but foundational depth. These were not arbitrary choices. They were solutions to problems already encountered and resolved. Yet the texts themselves remain silent on those problems. They do not narrate the crisis that necessitated such precision. They do not describe the loss that made measurement urgent. Once again, we encounter the same pattern. Results without records, answers without visible questions. In the quiet between these lines, a different image of early history takes shape. Not a triumphant ascent from simplicity, but a careful descent into stability. Knowledge narrowing rather than expanding, focused on what could be preserved. Complexity not growing wildly, but being trimmed into durable forms. The Sumerian world, viewed this way, feels less like a beginning and more like a holding pattern, a civilization pausing, anchoring itself after turbulence. The stars are measured because they are reliable. Numbers are trusted because they endure. Everything else is subject to loss. This perspective does not diminish their achievement. It reframes it. The true accomplishment may not have been discovery, but restraint. Choosing what to save, choosing what to repeat, choosing what to encode into systems that could survive disruption. And so, in the precise divisions of time and space, another quiet question takes shape. Not spoken, not emphasized, but present nonetheless. What kind of past produces a civilization that values stability over curiosity, preservation over invention, measurement over myth? The tablets do not answer. They continue counting, patiently, as if time itself were something already known to be fragile. As attention turns from numbers and stars to authority and rule, the same quiet irregularity persists. Power in the earliest Sumerian texts does not behave like something newly invented. Kingship is not presented as an experiment in governance, nor as a hard-won human achievement. It is treated as an arrangement that already exists, one that descends, transfers, withdraws, and returns, according to rules older than any individual ruler. Authority is inherited, not claimed. The Sumerian king list captures this tone with unsettling clarity. It does not argue for legitimacy. It does not justify succession. It simply records. Kingship moves from city to city as if following an invisible current. Reigns last centuries, sometimes millennia, without commentary. Then suddenly the lengths shorten, histories compress, mortality settles in. The shift is recorded without explanation, as though something fundamental changed, yet required no elaboration. What stands out is not the impossibility of these reigns, but the lack of surprise surrounding them. The scribes do not mark the transition as symbolic or metaphorical. They do not signal a change in narrative mode. The list proceeds with the same administrative calm, suggesting continuity rather than contradiction. Time behaves differently, and this difference is noted, not questioned. Law follows a similar pattern. Early legal texts do not present themselves as innovations. They codify relationships, responsibilities, penalties, and protections with an assumption that order already exists. The laws feel corrective rather than creative. They do not establish morality so much as reinforce balance. Wrongdoing is framed as disruption of an existing harmony, not violation of newly imposed rules. This orientation toward restoration appears repeatedly. Kings boast not of founding justice, but of returning it. Temples are rebuilt according to ancient plans. Rituals are revived, not invented. Even when power shifts through conquest, legitimacy is grounded in alignment with older forms. Authority is measured by fidelity to precedent. Such a worldview implies memory deeper than recorded history. One cannot restore what one has never known. The insistence on continuity suggests that loss has already occurred, that something precious slipped away once before, leaving behind only fragments and instructions. Rule, then, becomes an act of caretaking under the shadow of that loss. The titles themselves reflect this mindset. Ensi, Lugal, terms that imply stewardship as much as dominance. The ruler is a mediator between realms, not a source of law. Divine authority does not eliminate human responsibility. It heightens it. To rule poorly is not merely to fail politically, but to misalign with a larger order. This is not the language of emerging hierarchy. It is the language of maintenance. Hierarchy already exists. The task is to keep it from collapsing. Even rebellion is framed as deviation rather than revolution. The cosmos has a shape, and human power must fit within it. Over time, as later empires reinterpret these structures, the tone changes. Kings become conquerors, law becomes proclamation, gods become patrons of expansion. But in the earlier Sumerian layers, restraint dominates. Power is cautious. It remembers something fragile beneath its authority. Archaeological evidence reinforces this impression. Early city-states show careful planning, standardized practices, and long-term continuity. Sudden upheavals leave scars, but they are followed by restoration rather than reinvention. Each collapse is met not with novelty but with return. Return to what exactly remains undefined. The texts do not preserve a clear image of the original order they seek to restore. They preserve only the rules for maintaining it. This selective memory is revealing. It suggests that origins were either too distant, too sacred, or too painful to articulate. Pain leaves traces even when unnamed. The persistent emphasis on legitimacy, alignment, and continuity reads less like confidence and more like caution, learned through experience. A civilization that has never known collapse rarely writes this way. One that has survived it does. The role of divine authority further complicates this picture. The gods do not merely grant kingship, they regulate it. They withdraw favor when order breaks down. Floods, droughts, invasions, these are framed as corrections, not accidents. The universe responds to imbalance. Human rule exists within that response, not above it. This cosmic accountability discourages excess. Even the most powerful rulers remain vulnerable. Their names are preserved not for conquest alone, but for adherence to order. Memory becomes selective in a different way. What endures is not ambition, but alignment. As generations pass, the clarity of this framework dims. Later scribes embellish. Stories grow richer, motives multiply. Yet the foundational logic remains visible beneath the ornament. Authority is legitimate only when it remembers what came before. Seen from this angle, early Sumerian governance does not resemble the birth of political order. It resembles its reassembly. The structures are too complete, too integrated to have emerged suddenly. They feel like pieces fitted back together after damage, guided by memory rather than invention. This reading does not require imagining lost empires in grand detail. It requires only acknowledging that disruption leaves cultural shadows. Those shadows shape priorities. They elevate preservation over experimentation. They teach societies to value stability as survival. The Sumerian texts carry these lessons quietly. They do not warn explicitly. They do not dramatize catastrophe. They encode caution into law, kingship, and ritual. They teach rulers how to behave in a world where order has already proven fragile. And so, within the calm lists of kings and laws, another layer of unease settles in. Civilization here does not sound young. It sounds careful. It moves slowly, looks backward often, and measures legitimacy by closeness to something older than memory itself. The tablets do not tell us what that older order was. They do not need to. Their silence speaks through structure, through repetition, through the insistence that power is not created, only inherited. Whatever once broke the world enough to teach this lesson, its echo remains embedded in clay, waiting to be noticed. When the focus shifts from authority and structure to memory itself, the tone of the Sumerian record grows even quieter, almost cautious. Memory is treated not as something passive, but as a force that must be actively restrained, curated, and controlled. What is remembered matters. What is forgotten may be just as consequential. The earliest texts do not attempt to preserve everything. They preserve what seems necessary for continuity, leaving the rest to dissolve. This selectivity becomes especially visible in how disasters are treated. Floods, famines, invasions, and collapses are acknowledged, yet rarely explored in detail. They appear as interruptions rather than narratives. A city is destroyed. A temple falls silent. Then rebuilding begins. The emotional weight of the catastrophe is absent. What remains is function. What must be restored. What rituals must resume. What order must be re-established. Such restraint suggests not indifference, but familiarity. Events that are truly unprecedented tend to be described at length. Recurrent events are noted briefly. The Sumerian texts read like the record of a world that has already learned what destruction looks like and no longer needs to describe it in full. Attention shifts instead to recovery. This approach is reflected in how knowledge itself is archived. Tablets are categorized, copied, and stored with methodical care. Lists dominate, inventories, omens, lexical compilations. These are not the writings of a culture eager to express itself. They are the tools of one attempting to stabilize itself. Writing becomes less a mirror of life and more a scaffold to hold it together. The emotional distance is striking. Personal grief, fear, or triumph rarely surface. Instead, there is a steady emphasis on procedure. When something breaks, there is a correct way to fix it. When balance is lost, there is a prescribed response. Emotion, if present, is submerged beneath order. This pattern suggests a civilization shaped by repeated interruption. When loss becomes familiar, expression yields to function. One learns to record what helps survival and to let the rest pass quietly. Memory becomes disciplined. There are hints that this discipline was learned the hard way. Certain texts speak of times when writing itself was endangered. When tablets were destroyed, knowledge vanished with them. Scribes were trained not merely to write, but to copy endlessly to ensure redundancy. The act of repetition becomes a defense against erasure. Redundancy is not efficiency, it is insurance. It reflects an awareness that systems fail, that archives burn, that rivers rise. The care invested in copying suggests anxiety beneath the calm surface. The world has proven unreliable before. Even myth reflects this concern. Stories describe knowledge being hidden, sealed away, or entrusted to specific guardians. Sacred items are buried, names are concealed, access is restricted. Knowledge is powerful, but also vulnerable. To expose it carelessly is to risk losing it again. This tension between preservation and concealment shapes the entire cultural atmosphere. Too much openness invites chaos. Too much secrecy invites forgetting. The balance must be maintained carefully. Writing helps, but it is not enough on its own. Institutions, rituals, and hierarchies are required to support memory. From this perspective, civilization appears less as an engine of progress and more as a memory system. Cities function as storage devices. Temples act as archives. Rituals operate as mnemonic loops, repeating information through action rather than text. Society itself becomes a mechanism for remembering. This reframing alters how innovation is understood. Change is not celebrated unless it strengthens memory. New tools are acceptable if they preserve order. New ideas are tolerated if they align with inherited patterns. Anything that threatens continuity is approached with caution. Such caution may explain the conservative nature of early Sumerian culture. Artistic forms repeat, symbolic motifs persist, language remains stable for long periods. These are not signs of stagnation, but of intentional restraint. Stability is chosen over experimentation. The environment reinforces this choice. Mesopotamia offers abundance but demands constant vigilance. Irrigation systems collapse quickly if neglected. Social order frays under pressure. Memory, both technical and cultural, becomes essential infrastructure. Forgetting is not merely a personal failure, it is a collective risk. Over time, this emphasis on controlled memory shapes identity itself. Individuals matter less than roles, names matter less than functions. What endures is not personal story, but system integrity. The culture learns to value what survives. Later, civilizations would reinterpret this restraint as rigidity or lack of imagination, but within its original context, it appears adaptive. A society that has already lost something profound learns to be careful with what remains. The unsettling implication is that something significant was lost before the earliest surviving texts. Not just settlements or populations, but coherence. A break occurred that taught the value of redundancy, repetition, and control. The Sumerian response was not to mourn publicly, but to rebuild quietly. This silence around loss does not erase its presence. It shapes behavior subtly, persistently. The fear of forgetting becomes embedded in every tablet, every ritual, every law. Memory is no longer assumed. It is managed. As centuries pass, this management grows more complex. Libraries expand, schools formalize training, yet the original impulse remains unchanged. Preserve what matters, repeat what works, avoid unnecessary deviation. Seen this way, early civilization resembles a recovery process rather than a beginning, a careful reconstruction after disruption, a system designed to prevent collapse from happening unnoticed again. The texts do not frame it this way. They do not dramatize recovery or name trauma. They simply behave as though the lesson has already been learned. Memory is precious. Order is fragile. Silence is sometimes safer than explanation. And so, beneath the calm administrative surface of the tablets, a deeper narrative persists. One of a world that remembers breaking, even if it no longer remembers how. A world that learned to encode survival into structure, to let emotion fade while systems endure. In that quiet discipline, another shadow takes shape. Not of ignorance, but of experience. The kind of experience that teaches a civilization to write as though it might need to remember everything again, from scratch someday. As the record deepens, attention drifts toward the figures who move quietly between worlds in the Sumerian imagination. They are not central characters, not heroes in the later sense, but intermediaries. Beings who arrive with instructions, measurements, rituals, and then recede. Their presence is never dramatized. They are introduced as though already familiar, already accepted as part of how the world functions. These figures are often translated as gods, yet the texts treat them less like objects of devotion and more like sources of calibration. They establish boundaries, distribute responsibilities, define patterns. Once this work is done, they withdraw. The relationship is not emotional. It is procedural. Humanity is not invited into intimacy with them, only into alignment. What is striking is the lack of origin stories attached to these figures. They are not born. They do not evolve. They do not struggle into existence. They simply appear, already equipped with authority and knowledge. In later mythologies, such gaps are filled with elaborate genealogies. In the earliest layers, they are left open, unaddressed, as though explanation were unnecessary. This absence shifts the weight of interpretation. These beings do not feel like projections of human psychology. They feel like placeholders for something else, something that once acted, instructed, and then became distant. Whether symbolic or not, their role is consistent. They are transmitters, not creators. Transmission implies a prior state in which knowledge existed in a more complete form. The act of teaching suggests that humanity is entering a system already in motion. Learning once again resembles remembering. The world does not unfold through discovery, but through instruction. The calm tone surrounding these encounters is unsettling. There is no fear, no astonishment. Humans do not react as though encountering the unknown. The presence of these figures is treated as part of the expected order. This suggests familiarity, or at least acceptance shaped by tradition. Over time, as memory thins, these figures become mythologized. Their functions turn into personalities. Their instructions become commandments. Their withdrawal becomes mystery. But in the earliest texts, the emphasis remains on what they do, not who they are. Identity matters less than outcome. This functional portrayal aligns with the broader Sumerian worldview. Everything is evaluated by its role in maintaining balance. Even the divine is constrained by order. These figures do not act arbitrarily. They follow rules. They are accountable to structures older than themselves. Such restraint complicates later assumptions about belief. Worship in its emotional sense is not central here. What matters is correctness, proper ritual, accurate repetition, alignment with established patterns. Faith, if it exists, is secondary to precision. This precision extends to how knowledge is transferred. Instructions are specific, measurements exact, rituals detailed, ambiguity is minimized. The goal is not inspiration, but reliability. Knowledge must survive translation across generations without distortion. This concern may explain why symbolic language is used sparingly in early layers. Metaphor invites interpretation. Interpretation invites drift. Drift invites loss. The Sumerian texts avoid this by favoring clarity over poetry, even in matters later deemed spiritual. Yet clarity does not eliminate mystery. It concentrates it. By refusing to explain origins, the texts leave behind a silence that grows heavier with time. The question of where this knowledge came from becomes more unsettling precisely because it is not addressed. Some later traditions reinterpret these figures as ancestors, sages, or divine beings shaped by human imagination. Others read them as allegories for natural forces or social structures. Each interpretation attempts to close the gap left open by the original silence. But silence does not demand closure. It demands patience. The earliest record does not insist on meaning. It simply preserves function. In doing so, it allows multiple readings to coexist without resolution. This openness suggests that the scribes themselves may not have fully understood the origins of what they were preserving. They knew how to maintain it, not where it began. Their task was continuity, not explanation. In such a context, explanation may even have been dangerous. To speculate about origins risks error. Error risks misalignment. Misalignment risks collapse. It is safer to repeat what works than to ask how it came to be. The result is a civilization that carries deep knowledge without narrating its acquisition. A culture fluent in systems but reticent about beginnings. This reticence becomes one of its most distinctive features. As centuries pass, the distance between function and origin widens. Later cultures inherit the systems but not the caution. They tell stories to fill the silence. Gods become characters. Instruction becomes myth. The quiet intermediaries of Sumer take on dramatic form. Yet beneath those stories, the older structure remains visible. The same rituals, the same measurements, the same emphasis on alignment. The inheritance persists, even as its framing changes. This persistence raises a final unease. Systems outlasting their explanations often point to origins too distant or disruptive to preserve intact. What survives is what is useful. What is lost is what is fragile. The Sumerian record, in its restraint, seems aware of this truth. It does not attempt to carry everything forward. It carries what it must. The intermediaries deliver what is necessary. The rest fades. In this fading, another possibility emerges quietly. Perhaps the earliest texts are not incomplete by accident. Perhaps they are incomplete by design. A culture choosing to remember how to live, rather than how it once learned to live. The intermediaries, then, are not mysteries to be solved, but markers of transition, signs that knowledge crossed a threshold and changed form. What was once direct became mediated. What was once whole became segmented. The tablets do not mourn this transformation. They accept it. They work within its limits. They preserve what can be preserved and allow the rest to pass into silence. And so, the presence of these quiet figures leaves behind not answers, but orientation. A sense that civilization inherited more than it remembers, and remembers more than it can explain. The intermediaries fade, but their work remains embedded in the structure of the world. What remains is not a story of origins, but a pattern of transmission, a legacy carried forward carefully without commentary, as though the most important knowledge was not where it came from, but how easily it could be lost again. As the Sumerian world settles into its rhythms, attention turns quietly to how time itself is experienced. Not measured, not calculated, but lived. In these early records, time does not feel like a forward-moving arrow. It behaves more like a tide, advancing and retreating, eroding and restoring. The past is not left behind. It presses constantly against the present, shaping decisions, rituals, and expectations. This perception is visible in the way events are recorded. There is little emphasis on novelty. Moments are important not because they are new, but because they echo what has happened before. A flood is significant because it resembles earlier floods. A king's reign matters because it aligns or fails to align with established patterns. History is not a story of progress. It is a sequence of returns. The language itself reflects this sensibility. Words associated with restoration appear more frequently than those associated with creation. To rebuild, to renew, to re-establish, these actions define success. The idea of beginning something entirely new carries no special weight. What matters is whether the rhythm continues uninterrupted. This cyclical experience of time reshapes responsibility. If the future mirrors the past, then preparation outweighs ambition. One does not strive to surpass ancestors, but to remain worthy of them. Memory becomes a guide, not a burden. Forgetting becomes the true danger, not failure. Such an orientation toward time suggests a civilization that has already witnessed abrupt endings. Cultures that believe in endless ascent often disregard preservation. Cultures that have seen collapse organize themselves differently. They expect interruption. They prepare for recurrence. Seasonal cycles reinforce this worldview. Agriculture depends on repetition. Planting, flooding, harvest. Each follows a rhythm older than any individual life. The land teaches patience. It rewards those who remember, not those who innovate recklessly. Time, here, is something to align with, not conquer. The gods themselves are bound to cycles. They rise and fall in prominence. Their favor shifts. They respond to imbalance rather than impose destiny. Even the divine is not outside time, but embedded within it. This removes the possibility of final resolution. Order must be maintained continuously. This continuous maintenance alters how meaning is constructed. Meaning does not accumulate, it circulates. Rituals do not commemorate singular events, they reactivate memory. Each performance is both repetition and renewal, holding the past briefly in the present before releasing it again. In this context, prophecy does not predict distant futures. It warns of returning patterns. Omens are valuable not because they reveal something unprecedented, but because they signal alignment or deviation from what is known. The future is readable only insofar as the past is remembered. Such a worldview leaves little room for linear destiny. There is no guaranteed culmination, no final triumph. The universe does not move toward completion. It moves toward balance, then away from it, again and again. This cyclical understanding may explain the emotional restraint of the texts. When endings are expected, they lose dramatic power. When beginnings are temporary, they lose celebratory force. What remains is attentiveness. The present moment must be managed carefully because it will return in altered form. Later civilizations would struggle with this inheritance. As empires expanded, they adopted narratives of progress, conquest, and destiny. Time became something to master. Yet beneath those narratives, older cycles persisted, occasionally resurfacing during moments of collapse. The Sumerian approach to time feels closer to geological memory than historical narrative. Layers accumulate, pressure builds. Release occurs, the surface changes, but the pattern remains. Humanity occupies only a thin layer within this vast repetition. This perspective diminishes human centrality without diminishing human responsibility. Humans matter precisely because their actions affect balance. Small deviations accumulate, neglect compounds, carelessness invites correction. Time remembers, even when people do not. Writing, once again, becomes a tool of synchronization. Tablets anchor moments within cycles. They mark alignment. They serve as reference points when memory falters. Writing does not freeze time. It helps society re-enter it correctly after disruption. There is a quiet humility in this relationship with time. The future is not promised. It is negotiated continuously. Survival depends on responsiveness, not certainty. The world is not hostile but indifferent. It responds to patterns, not intentions. Such humility may feel foreign to modern expectations, yet it carries a certain calm. Anxiety about distant futures gives way to attention to the present cycle. The task is simple, though not easy. Remember what keeps the world in balance. This calm is not complacency. It is vigilance without drama. The Sumerian texts do not express hope in transformation. They express commitment to continuity. Each generation becomes a bridge rather than a destination. Seen through this lens, early civilization appears less concerned with origins and more concerned with rhythm. The question is not how everything began, but how it continues. Beginnings matter less than endurance. The unsettling implication is that time, as experienced by these early people, already carried the weight of loss. Cycles are comforting only to those who have seen them break. Repetition becomes meaningful when interruption is remembered. The tablets do not record that interruption directly. They do not narrate the moment when time itself seemed to fracture, but their structure implies it. Their insistence on alignment implies recovery. Their calm implies experience. And so, within the Sumerian understanding of time, another quiet echo of an earlier rupture persists. A world that no longer trusts in straight lines. A civilization that lives inside recurrence, attentive, careful, prepared to begin again without calling it a beginning. Time moves, returns, and moves again. The tablets follow its rhythm, not to explain it, but to remain within it. In that steady repetition, history becomes less a story to be told and more a pattern to be remembered, one that holds the present gently, while reminding it how easily it can be lost. As the Sumerian world unfolds further, a subtler tension begins to appear in how truth itself is treated. Not truth as belief, but truth as alignment between word and action, record and reality, sign and outcome. The earliest texts are not concerned with persuading or convincing. They assume a shared understanding of what matters. Their primary concern is whether that understanding remains accurate over time. This concern is visible in the obsessive care taken with record-keeping. Names, quantities, dates, and formulas are repeated with almost ritual consistency. Errors are corrected. Variations are minimized. Truth, in this sense, is not philosophical. It is operational. Something is true if it works, if it holds the system together, if it preserves balance. Such an approach implies that truth is fragile. It can drift. It can decay. It can be distorted through repetition if not carefully managed. The scribes do not trust memory alone. They externalize it into clay, transforming truth into something heavy, durable, and slow to change. This weight carries emotional significance. Light truths are easily altered. Heavy truths resist manipulation. Clay does not lend itself to improvisation. Once impressed and dried, it demands commitment. Writing becomes a way of binding the present to the past, limiting the freedom to reinterpret casually. The absence of commentary in these records is telling. The scribes rarely explain why something is written a certain way, they simply write it. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites divergence. Divergence threatens coherence. Silence, in this context, is a stabilizing force. Later cultures would expand upon these records, adding narrative, symbolism, and moral framing. In doing so, they would transform operational truth into interpretive truth. Meaning becomes flexible. Stories multiply. Belief systems emerge. Yet beneath those layers, the earlier rigidity remains visible. This rigidity is not intellectual poverty. It is strategic restraint. A culture that has experienced distortion learns to fear interpretation. Interpretation opens space for disagreement. Disagreement fragments systems. Fragmentation invites collapse. The Sumerian response is not to eliminate interpretation entirely, but to constrain it. Certain texts are restricted, certain knowledge reserved. Truth is tiered, not democratized. This hierarchy of understanding protects the core from erosion. Such protection suggests prior erosion. One does not build walls around truth unless it has been threatened. The texts themselves do not describe this threat. They respond to it indirectly, through structure rather than story. Even myth, when it appears, is bounded tightly. Myths are not sprawling epics in the earliest layers. They are concise, functional, focused on cause and consequence. They explain why rituals exist, why boundaries matter, why order must be preserved. They do not invite speculation beyond that. This functional use of myth contrasts sharply with later traditions where myth becomes a space for imagination and transcendence. In Sumer, myth remains anchored to practice. It exists to stabilize behavior, not to inspire escape. Truth, then, is something to be enacted rather than contemplated. One lives truth by performing rituals correctly, by maintaining systems, by aligning with inherited patterns. Abstract belief is secondary. Correct action is primary. This orientation reshapes morality as well. Good and evil are not absolute categories. They are conditions of alignment or misalignment. An action is wrong if it disrupts balance, right if it restores it. Intent matters less than effect. Such pragmatism reflects a worldview shaped by consequence. When actions have immediate, visible impact on survival, morality becomes practical. There is little room for abstraction detached from outcome. The environment reinforces this ethic. Irrigation channels collapse if mismanaged. Floods punish negligence without moral commentary. The land does not care about intention, it responds to pattern. Truth, therefore, must correspond to reality, not desire. Writing, once again, serves as mediator. It freezes patterns long enough to be transmitted. It reduces reliance on individual judgment. It creates continuity across generations that never meet. Truth becomes communal rather than personal. This communal truth is not negotiated, it is inherited. One enters it by learning, copying, repeating. Creativity exists, but within limits. Innovation must prove its compatibility with existing structures before it is accepted. The quiet anxiety beneath this system is palpable. Truth can be lost. It can be corrupted. It can be overwritten by convenience or ambition. The early texts respond by minimizing exposure. They say only what is necessary. This minimalism frustrates modern readers. We look for explanation, for context, for justification. The tablets offer none. They behave as though explanation itself were risky. Perhaps it was. In a world where knowledge had already been broken once, adding unnecessary layers might have felt irresponsible. Better to preserve function than to embellish meaning. This preservation extends even to the gods. Divine truth is not presented as revelation in the modern sense. It is procedural knowledge delivered once, then maintained. The gods do not speak constantly. They establish, then withdraw. Their withdrawal reinforces the burden placed on human memory. Without constant correction from above, humans must rely on record and ritual. Truth becomes something humans must carry, not something handed down repeatedly. Over time, as systems stabilize, this burden lightens. Interpretation returns, philosophy emerges, stories grow. Yet the early foundation remains visible in the shape of institutions and assumptions. Seen this way, early Sumerian civilization resembles a culture recovering from epistemic shock. Not just loss of land or people, but loss of certainty. When truth itself proves unstable, one learns to anchor it carefully. The tablets become anchors, heavy, repetitive, unyielding. They do not float freely in imagination. They sit pressed into earth, resisting movement. This resistance gives them their quiet power. They do not persuade. They endure. They carry forward a way of knowing that values stability over expression, alignment over insight. The unsettling implication is that truth, for the Sumerians, was something that had already failed once, something that had proven vulnerable to forgetting, distortion, or destruction. Their response was not despair, but discipline. Discipline leaves few emotional traces. It produces order, not confession. The fear that shaped it remains implicit, encoded in structure rather than speech. As the record continues, this disciplined truth becomes the ground upon which everything else rests. Law, ritual, kingship, cosmology all depend on its stability. Without it, nothing holds. The tablets do not tell us when truth first fractured, or how. They do not describe the confusion that preceded their order. They simply assume the lesson has been learned, and so, within their calm precision, another shadow remains. A sense that knowing is not natural, not guaranteed, but earned and easily lost. A civilization that learned to treat truth as something heavy, fragile, and worth protecting at all costs. The clay holds that lesson quietly. It does not explain it. It does not defend it. It simply remains, bearing the weight of a memory about knowledge itself, one that history has not fully remembered, but has never entirely escaped. As the Sumerian legacy passes quietly into the hands of the later cultures, a subtle transformation takes place, one that does not erase the old structures, but reshapes how they are understood. What was once preserved as procedure begins to be retold as story. What was once maintained through repetition becomes explained through narrative. In this transition, something delicate shifts. Memory loosens its grip, and meaning begins to drift. The earliest tablets speak with restraint. They do not argue, they do not persuade, they assume continuity. Later texts, however, begin to fill silences. Gods acquire personalities, events acquire motives. The calm architecture of maintenance becomes animated by explanation. This change does not happen abruptly. It unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly, across generations who inherit systems without inheriting the original caution that shaped them. As writing spreads and literacy widens, the function of text changes. No longer merely a stabilizing tool, it becomes a vehicle for identity, legitimacy, and belief. Stories begin to justify power rather than simply align with order. The past becomes something to interpret, not merely preserve. In this reinterpretation, authority subtly shifts. Where Sumerian kings once grounded legitimacy in restoration, later rulers ground it in destiny. Where order was once maintained through alignment, it is now defended through narrative. The same structures remained, law, ritual, hierarchy, but their emotional framing evolves. Meaning grows louder, certainty grows more declarative. This evolution carries consequences. When systems are justified through story rather than practice, they become vulnerable to revision. Stories can be edited, emphasized, omitted. The past becomes flexible. Memory, once heavy and resistant, grows lighter, easier to shape. This lightness allows continuity to extend across empires, but it also allows distortion. Elements that no longer serve current needs fade quietly. Others are amplified. The old Sumerian restraint gives way to confidence, even ambition. History becomes a resource rather than a responsibility. Yet beneath this shift, traces of the earlier mindset remain embedded. Measurement systems persist. Ritual calendars endure. Legal structures echo older forms. Even when their origins are forgotten, their presence continues to shape behavior. The inheritance survives, even as its meaning changes. This survival without understanding creates a peculiar tension. Later cultures build upon foundations they did not design, using tools whose original purpose has dimmed. The systems still work, but no longer inspire caution. When imbalance occurs, it is addressed through force or ideology rather than alignment. The quiet fear of forgetting, so evident in the earliest texts, gradually dissolves. Confidence replaces vigilance. Innovation accelerates. Expansion becomes virtue. The memory of collapse recedes into abstraction. Yet collapse does not vanish. It returns in new forms. Empires rise rapidly and fall violently. Knowledge is lost and rediscovered. Libraries burn. Cities vanish. Each time, fragments of the old inheritance resurface. Recognizable but altered. In these cycles, the Sumerian contribution is rarely acknowledged explicitly. It is absorbed, renamed, reframed. Their numbers persist. Their divisions of time persist. Their concept of order persists. But the emotional discipline that once accompanied these systems is diluted. This dilution invites reinterpretation of origins themselves. Long reigns become myths. Intermediaries become gods. Cycles become allegory. The practical memory of recovery transforms into symbolic narrative. What was once lived experience becomes distant story. Institutions play a role in this transformation. As power centralizes, history becomes something to manage. Certain narratives are preserved. Others are marginalized. Memory is curated not only for continuity, but for control. The past becomes a tool. This does not require malicious intent. It arises naturally when stability seems assured. When survival no longer feels precarious, caution appears unnecessary. Explanation replaces repetition. Confidence replaces humility. Yet systems remember what people forget. When conditions change, climate shifts, resources strain, networks fracture, the old vulnerabilities return. Suddenly maintenance matters again. Alignment matters again. The quiet lessons embedded in ancient structures resurface, often too late to prevent damage, but enough to shape recovery. In these moments, civilizations rediscover restraint. They rebuild, they restore, they look backward for guidance. The pattern repeats, echoing the earlier Sumerian posture without conscious imitation. This repetition suggests that early civilization did not merely invent systems, it encoded responses to disruption, responses that remain relevant whenever complexity exceeds stability. The true inheritance is not technological, but behavioral. Behavior, however, is harder to preserve than tools. It requires memory, discipline, and humility. Without these, systems become brittle. They function until they fail, then fail dramatically. The Sumerian texts, in their silence, seem to anticipate this brittleness. Their refusal to explain origins may have been an attempt to prevent overconfidence. By focusing on function rather than story, they kept attention on practice. As later cultures moved away from this focus, the risk of forgetting grew. Not forgetting facts, but forgetting limits, forgetting fragility, forgetting that order is not self-sustaining. This forgetting does not announce itself, it accumulates slowly. Systems appear robust until they are not. History records the fall, but rarely the long drift that preceded it. In this light, the Sumerian legacy feels less like a beginning and more like a warning transmitted indirectly. A reminder that civilization survives not through explanation, but through attentiveness, not through belief, but through alignment. The warning is not spoken, it is embedded in form, in repetition, in restraint. Those who inherit the systems without inheriting the caution may enjoy long periods of stability, but they also court sudden collapse. The tablets themselves cannot prevent this. They can only endure. Their endurance is quiet, patient, indifferent to interpretation. They wait beneath layers of story, ideology, and ambition, holding a different posture toward history. That posture does not deny progress. It doubts permanence. It does not reject meaning. It limits it. It does not fear the future. It prepares for its uncertainty. As the Sumerian inheritance dissolves into the wider ancient world, its most important contribution becomes increasingly invisible. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is foundational. Like the ground beneath a building, it is noticed only when it shifts. And so, beneath the confident narratives of later civilizations, another shadow remains. A memory of a time when continuity could not be taken for granted, when order had to be protected from forgetting, when history was not a story to be told, but a balance to be maintained. The earliest texts do not insist that we remember this, they simply demonstrate it. Their calm endurance suggests that civilizations rise and fall, stories change, meanings drift, but the need for restraint returns again and again whenever complexity forgets how fragile it truly is. As the long arc of inheritance continues, another subtle distortion becomes visible, not in what later civilizations added, but in what they began to overlook. The deeper Sumerian posture toward uncertainty gradually thins. What was once treated as an ever-present condition becomes an inconvenience to be resolved. The unknown, instead of being respected, is increasingly framed as something to conquer. In the earliest layers, uncertainty is woven quietly into structure. Systems exist because outcomes are not guaranteed. Rituals repeat because alignment can drift. Records are copied because memory fails. Nothing assumes permanence. By contrast, later cultures begin to assume that the world, once ordered, will remain so unless actively disrupted by enemies or fate. This shift alters how risk is perceived. In Sumer, risk is internal. It lies in neglect, imbalance, forgetting. In later frameworks, risk becomes external. It is attributed to invasion, impiety, or misfortune. The focus moves outward, away from the quiet vulnerabilities embedded within complex systems. This outward turn encourages confidence. If disorder comes from outside, then strength, expansion, and control appear as solutions. Maintenance gives way to dominance. Alignment yields to assertion. The same tools that once preserved balance are repurposed to enforce will. Yet the inherited systems are not designed for this posture. They tolerate care better than pressure. When used aggressively, they begin to strain. Irrigation networks falter when expansion outpaces maintenance. Administrative complexity grows brittle when speed replaces attentiveness. Knowledge becomes compartmentalized, losing the integrative coherence it once possessed. The Sumerian emphasis on wholeness, where ritual, economy, astronomy, and law inform one another, gradually fragments. Specialization increases efficiency, but weakens memory. When knowledge is divided, no single part remembers the entire system. Failure becomes harder to anticipate. This fragmentation also affects language. Words once tied closely to function take on symbolic or rhetorical meaning. Precision softens, ambiguity grows. Communication becomes persuasive rather than corrective. Truth shifts again, becoming something argued rather than enacted. None of this occurs abruptly. It unfolds slowly, often imperceptibly. Each generation inherits systems that still work well enough. Small deviations accumulate unnoticed. The memory of fragility fades, replaced by stories of resilience and destiny. These stories are compelling. They offer meaning, purpose, direction. They help societies cohere at larger scales, but they also obscure limits. When destiny replaces balance as a guiding principle, correction is delayed. Warning signs are reinterpreted as challenges to overcome, rather than signals to slow down. The Sumerian worldview, by contrast, leaves little room for destiny. There is no promised culmination, no inevitable triumph, only cycles of alignment and misalignment. The absence of destiny keeps attention focused on the present condition rather than the imagined future. As destiny narratives spread, history itself begins to change shape. The past is no longer a repository of caution, but a ladder toward greatness. Earlier collapses are reframed as necessary steps. Loss becomes meaningful rather than instructive. The lesson shifts from be careful to be bold. This boldness accelerates innovation, expansion, and consolidation. It also increases the scale of collapse when it arrives. Larger systems fail more dramatically. Their recovery takes longer. Their memory is more difficult to preserve. When such collapses occur, societies often rediscover older patterns. They rebuild, they restore, they simplify. In these moments, echoes of the Sumerian posture return, temporarily. Maintenance regains value. Alignment matters again. But as stability returns, confidence follows and the cycle resumes. The recurrence of this pattern suggests that early civilization did not merely encode techniques, but insights about complexity itself. Insights that are difficult to hold on to during periods of success. The more effective systems become, the easier it is to forget why they exist. The Sumerian texts, sparse and procedural, resist this forgetting. Their lack of narrative grandeur denies easy appropriation. They do not flatter ambition. They do not promise transcendence. They remind quietly that order is conditional. This conditionality applies even to knowledge. As disciplines separate and expertise deepens, the integrative awareness that once connected them weakens. Specialists know more about less. The whole becomes abstract. Systems grow opaque to those who rely on them. Opacity increases vulnerability. When few understand how a system works in full, correction becomes reactive rather than preventative. Crises surprise. Responses are improvised. Recovery depends on rediscovering principles that were once implicit. The Sumerian approach avoided this opacity by embedding knowledge across practice. Ritual taught astronomy. Law reinforced ecology. Architecture encoded cosmology. Learning was holistic because survival demanded it. As later cultures moved away from this integration, they gained flexibility but lost coherence. Flexibility allows adaptation, but coherence enables foresight. Without foresight, adaptation becomes reaction. The tension between these two modes, coherence and flexibility, runs quietly through history. Periods of expansion favor flexibility. Periods of contraction favor coherence. The Sumerian legacy sits firmly on the side of coherence, shaped by contraction already experienced. This suggests that what we call early history may represent a post-traumatic phase rather than an inaugural one. A moment when lessons had been learned too deeply to ignore. Over time, as those lessons faded, history began to resemble a new beginning, until disruption reminded societies otherwise. The tablets do not mark this dynamic explicitly. They do not diagnose future civilizations. They simply model a posture, one that privileges care over confidence, alignment over ambition, memory over myth. That posture is difficult to sustain. It lacks drama. It offers no promise of exceptional destiny. It requires humility in the face of complexity. Such humility rarely survives long periods of success, and yet it returns. Whenever systems strain beyond their limits, whenever growth outpaces understanding, whenever history seems to fracture unexpectedly. In those moments, the old lessons resurface, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes too late. The Sumerian record remains as a quiet witness to this cycle, not predicting it, not warning against it, simply demonstrating an alternative way of being within complexity, one shaped by experience rather than optimism. In its restraint, it offers a mirror, not of who humanity was becoming, but of what it had already endured, a civilization speaking softly because it had learned that loud certainty often precedes collapse. The question it leaves behind is not whether progress is possible, but whether memory can survive success, whether systems can retain humility once stability returns, whether the lessons learned through loss can endure prosperity. The tablets do not answer, they do not speculate, they simply endure, carrying forward a posture toward uncertainty that history repeatedly forgets and repeatedly rediscovers whenever the weight of complexity becomes too heavy to ignore. As the inherited structures spread outward and time stretches further from their source, a final quiet shift becomes visible in how loss itself is understood. In the earliest Sumerian posture, loss is assumed. It is not an exception, it is a condition. Later cultures would grieve loss, explain it, justify it, or mythologize it. The Sumerian texts do something different. They work around it. This difference is subtle but profound. Loss is not framed as tragedy requiring meaning. It is treated as disruption requiring response. Cities fall, fields fail, knowledge thins. The reaction is not lamentation, but repair. What matters is not why something was lost, but whether continuity can be restored. This orientation strips loss of drama. It becomes part of the landscape like flood or drought. One prepares for it, mitigates it, adapts to it. Emotion does not disappear, but it is subordinated to function. Survival depends on acting before grief overwhelms capacity. Such discipline suggests familiarity. Cultures encountering loss for the first time tend to record it vividly. They describe devastation in detail. They seek meaning in catastrophe. The Sumerian restraint implies repetition. Loss has occurred before. It no longer demands narration. This may explain why so little space is devoted to mourning in the texts. Death is acknowledged, but rarely explored. Names are recorded, then replaced. The emphasis remains on roles continuing, not lives ending. Identity is less important than persistence. In this framework, continuity becomes the highest value. Not permanence, which is impossible, but recurrence. The system must be able to resume after interruption. Everything else is secondary. Even memory is valued primarily for its utility and restoration. This practicality reshapes how history is written. Instead of preserving emotional truth, it preserves operational truth. What allows rebuilding is recorded. What does not is allowed to fade. History becomes a manual, not a confession. Such manuals do not age gracefully. They frustrate later readers seeking story and meaning. Their silence feels evasive, but their silence may be intentional, a refusal to burden the future with pain it does not need to carry. This refusal creates distance. We sense that something is missing but cannot name it. The absence becomes a presence of its own, shaping interpretation. We look for what is not said and imagine what might have been endured. The environment once again provides context. Mesopotamia demanded resilience. Settlements existed at the mercy of rivers that both sustained and destroyed them. Excessive attachment to what was lost would have paralyzed response. Letting go was adaptive. This adaptability may have extended beyond material loss. Social structures, beliefs, even knowledge could be shed if they no longer served continuity. The culture appears capable of pruning itself, preserving only what remained functional. Such pruning carries risk. Valuable insight can be lost along with excess. But the alternative, hoarding memory indiscriminately, can overwhelm capacity. The Sumerian solution favors lean survival over comprehensive preservation. This approach contrasts sharply with modern historical instincts. We seek total reconstruction. We mourn what is lost. We attempt to recover every fragment. The Sumerians appear to have chosen differently. They preserved selectively, trusting the future to work within what remained. That trust feels unsettling. It implies acceptance of limitation, acceptance that some things cannot be carried forward, acceptance that civilization is not cumulative in a simple sense, but cyclical, shedding and regaining complexity as conditions allow. Within this cycle, loss becomes formative rather than destructive. It shapes priorities, it disciplines ambition, it teaches restraint. The absence of explicit grief may not signal emotional numbness, but a deeper understanding of impermanence. Impermanence, in this worldview, is not an abstract principle. It is lived reality. Structures collapse, names vanish, even gods recede. What persists is pattern, not substance, rhythm, not artifact. Writing participates in this rhythm. Tablets endure longer than memory, but not forever. They too can be broken, buried, eroded. The act of writing acknowledges this fragility. It is an attempt, not a guarantee. This acknowledgement produces humility. Nothing written is assumed to last. Therefore, what is written must matter. This urgency shapes content. Only what aids continuity earns a place in clay. Over centuries, as writing becomes more abundant and confident, this urgency softens, text multiplies, preservation expands. But in the earliest layers, scarcity governs expression. The silence around loss reflects this economy. The result is a historical record that feels incomplete yet intentional. Gaps remain where explanation might be expected. Those gaps invite speculation, but they also convey a lesson. Not everything needs to be remembered to survive. This lesson challenges modern assumptions about progress and accumulation. It suggests that civilizations may thrive not by remembering more, but by remembering wisely, by choosing what to carry and what to release. Such choices are rarely visible in retrospect. We see what remains and assume it represents the whole. The Sumerian record reminds us that what remains may be only what was deemed necessary at the time. This realization reframes the mystery of early history. The absence of origins may not be accidental. It may be the result of deliberate forgetting, guided by survival rather than curiosity. Deliberate forgetting is uncomfortable to contemplate. It implies agency in loss. It suggests that some knowledge was allowed to vanish because carrying it forward posed risk or burden. The texts do not confirm this. They do not deny it either. They simply proceed as though the decision has already been made. In doing so, they place the weight of interpretation on the present. We must decide how to respond to incomplete memory, whether to fill gaps with story or sit with silence. The Sumerian posture leans towards silence. Not emptiness, but restraint. A refusal to overinterpret what cannot be maintained. This refusal grants the record its strange calm. As the inherited systems continue to evolve beyond Sumer, this calm becomes harder to maintain. Expansion invites explanation. Explanation invites confidence. Confidence invites forgetting. Yet the original lesson remains embedded, faint but persistent. Whenever systems strain, whenever loss returns unexpectedly, the old posture resurfaces. Repair over lament, alignment over ambition, continuity over meaning. The Sumerian texts do not teach this explicitly. They embody it. Their silence around loss is not neglect, but instruction. In that silence, another shadow lingers, a recognition that civilization survives not by clinging to everything it has been, but by knowing what it must let go of to continue. The tablets offer no comfort in this. They do not console. They simply endure, bearing witness to a way of living with loss that does not seek to resolve it, only to move forward within its limits. And perhaps that is their quiet warning. That history, when stripped of its stories, reveals not a triumphant ascent, but a series of careful continuations, each shaped by what could not be carried forward, yet never entirely forgotten. As the modern world slowly rediscovers the Sumerian record through excavation and translation, another transformation quietly unfolds, this time not within the ancient culture itself, but within those who attempt to interpret it. Clay tablets emerge into a world shaped by linear history, progress narratives, and confidence in cumulative knowledge. The encounter is uneasy. The texts do not behave as expected. They resist framing. They refuse to align neatly with modern assumptions about beginnings. Archaeology at first treats these records as origins, the earliest writing, the first cities, the dawn of civilization. Yet the deeper scholars look, the more this language begins to feel misplaced. What is uncovered does not resemble an experimental phase. It resembles continuity interrupted. Systems appear intact, not tentative. Knowledge arrives organized, not emergent. The sensation is less of discovery and more of intrusion into a process already underway. This dissonance creates interpretive pressure. Modern frameworks seek causes, timelines, developmental arcs. The tablets offer maintenance, lists, procedures. Where modern thought expects explanation, the ancient record offers repetition. Where curiosity looks for narrative, the clay insists on structure. In response, interpretation fills the silence. Long reigns are declared symbolic. Divine figures are recast as metaphors. Cycles are flattened into allegory. These readings are not unreasonable, but they often reveal more about modern discomfort than ancient intent. The urge to explain becomes a way of restoring familiarity. Yet each explanation risks obscuring what makes the Sumerian record distinctive: its refusal to dramatize, its resistance to origin stories, its quiet confidence that continuity matters more than beginnings. By translating restraint into symbolism, modern interpretation may inadvertently strip the texts of their lived posture. The rediscovery process itself mirrors an older pattern. Knowledge surfaces after long burial, fragments are gathered, gaps remain. Reconstruction proceeds cautiously at first, then with increasing certainty. Over time, consensus forms. The unknown becomes manageable, the discomfort fades. But something essential may be lost in this smoothing. The ancient anxiety about forgetting does not translate easily into modern optimism about recovery. We assume that excavation restores what was lost. The Sumerian posture suggests otherwise. Recovery is partial, restoration is imperfect, memory returns altered. This altered memory shapes contemporary understanding of early history. Civilization becomes a ladder rather than a loop. Each culture builds upon the last. Collapse is framed as regression rather than recurrence. The lessons embedded in ancient restraint fade behind the allure of advancement. Yet the material record continues to resist full assimilation. Tablets do not suddenly become expressive when translated. They remain procedural. They still prioritize alignment over meaning. Their calm persists, even as interpretations shift around them. This persistence creates a subtle unease. Why does the earlier civilization sound so tired? Why does it speak as though endurance were already a concern? Why does it write like something that has survived rather than something that has just begun? Modern scholarship often sidesteps these questions by narrowing focus. Individual texts are isolated. Contexts are segmented. Disciplines divide responsibility. Each fragment becomes manageable, but the whole grows harder to perceive. In this fragmentation, the integrative logic of Sumer is lost once more. The same process that later ancient cultures underwent repeats in modern study. Specialization increases clarity locally, while obscuring coherence globally. The system that once held knowledge together dissolves again into parts. This repetition is not accidental. Complex systems tend to forget their origins. They retain function but lose posture. The ancient warning embedded in restraint resurfaces subtly in the modern condition. Contemporary society too assumes continuity. Infrastructure is trusted. Knowledge is abundant. Records are digital, replicated endlessly. Forgetting feels unlikely. Yet the Sumerian record reminds quietly that abundance does not guarantee preservation. Systems fail in unexpected ways. Memory depends on context, not quantity. The rediscovery of ancient texts during periods of modern upheaval, wars, collapses, technological shifts, adds another layer of resonance. Each rediscovery occurs within a world experiencing its own fractures. The past speaks not as reassurance, but as mirror. This mirroring does not provide answers, it reframes attention. The ancient concern with maintenance over meaning challenges modern confidence in explanation. The refusal to narrate loss challenges modern fascination with catastrophe. The prioritization of alignment over ambition challenges modern ideals of progress. None of these challenges are explicit. The tablets do not instruct, they simply persist. Their endurance becomes their message. In museums and academic journals, the Sumerian world is reconstructed as artifact. But as artifact, it loses its original function. What was once a living system of memory becomes an object of study. Observation replaces participation. Distance replaces continuity. This distance makes it easier to dismiss the ancient posture as obsolete. Modern complexity feels different. Modern systems feel more robust. Yet complexity, regardless of era, carries similar vulnerabilities. Scale increases risk. Speed amplifies error. Interdependence magnifies disruption. The Sumerian emphasis on restraint speaks quietly to these conditions, not as prophecy, but as precedent. It demonstrates what it looks like to live inside complexity without trusting it fully. That demonstration is easy to overlook because it lacks drama. It offers no spectacle. It does not dramatize collapse or promise salvation. It simply models behavior shaped by experience. Modern audiences often search ancient texts for revelation, secrets, hidden knowledge. The Sumerian record offers none of these in obvious form. Its secrecy lies in plain sight, embedded in what it chooses not to say. What it does not say may be as important as what it preserves. The absence of origin stories, heroic narratives, and moral proclamations suggests a culture that understood the danger of overconfidence. A culture that knew explanation could mislead as easily as enlighten. This understanding does not translate neatly into modern frameworks. It sits uncomfortably beside narratives of discovery and ascent. It asks for patience rather than insight, for attentiveness rather than certainty. As translation improves and scholarship advances, the temptation to finalize interpretation grows, to settle debates, to close gaps. Yet the Sumerian record resists closure. Its silences remain intact. Those silences invite a different kind of engagement. Not mastery, but listening. Not reconstruction, but recognition. Recognition that early civilization may not fit the story modernity wants to tell about itself. The rediscovery of Sumer, then, becomes more than an academic achievement. It becomes a test of whether modern culture can encounter an ancient worldview without immediately reshaping it to fit familiar narratives. So far, the result is mixed. Explanations proliferate, confidence grows, yet the unease persists, surfacing in questions that refuse to go away. Why does the beginning feel like an echo? Why does the first chapter read like a continuation? The tablets do not respond. They do not adjust themselves to interpretation. They remain what they are, fragments of a system that valued survival over story, alignment over ambition, continuity over meaning. In their quiet persistence, they offer a final provocation. Not to rewrite early history, but to reconsider what it means to begin. To ask whether civilization always starts where we think it does, or whether it sometimes resumes, carefully, silently, after something has already been lost. The clay does not answer. It does not need to. Its endurance is enough to remind us that history may be less about invention than recovery, less about ascent than balance, and far more fragile than modern confidence is willing to admit. As the long thread of interpretation stretches toward the present, a final tension begins to surface, one that lives not in the tablets themselves, but in the space between ancient restraint and modern urgency. The Sumerian record does not invite haste. It unfolds slowly, deliberately, indifferent to the speed at which later cultures consume meaning. This difference in tempo becomes increasingly significant the closer we draw to our own time. Modern civilization moves quickly, information multiplies, systems accelerate, decisions are made under pressure rather than reflection. In such an environment, the Sumerian posture feels almost alien. Its patience appears impractical. Its caution seems excessive. Yet this very slowness may be the most difficult aspect of its inheritance to absorb. The earliest texts were written for continuity, not impact. They were never meant to compete for attention. Their power lies in accumulation rather than immediacy. Each tablet contributes a small, stabilizing weight. Together they form a counterbalance to chaos. This approach does not scale easily in cultures driven by novelty. As speed increases, memory changes character. It becomes externalized, automated, fragmented. The burden once carried by ritual and repetition shifts to storage and retrieval. Trust moves from human attentiveness to system reliability. Forgetting feels less threatening because backups exist. Yet this trust introduces new fragility. Systems that store memory can fail all at once. When failure occurs, recovery depends not on redundancy alone, but on understanding. The Sumerian approach anticipated this. Redundancy was paired with comprehension embedded in practice. Knowledge lived not only in text but in action. Modern systems often separate these domains. Instructions are written but rarely embodied. Processes are documented but not fully understood by those who rely on them. This separation creates efficiency but weakens resilience. When disruption occurs, the written record may survive while the ability to act upon it does not. The Sumerian world appears shaped by awareness of this risk. Writing did not replace practice, it reinforced it. Ritual ensured that knowledge remained active. Law ensured that memory was enacted regularly. The system was kept alive through repetition. This integration becomes harder to maintain as complexity grows. Modern societies depend on layers of abstraction, invisible to most participants. Few understand the full systems that sustain daily life. Stability depends on specialists, and specialists depend on infrastructure beyond their control. In such a context, the ancient emphasis on alignment rather than mastery takes on new relevance. Alignment asks not whether a system can be controlled, but whether it remains coherent. It shifts focus from expansion to maintenance, from innovation to integration. This shift runs counter to dominant modern narratives. Progress is celebrated, growth is expected, efficiency is prized. Maintenance is often invisible, undervalued, postponed. The Sumerian record quietly challenges this imbalance. It does so without critique, without comparison, without instruction. Its challenge lies in contrast. It presents a civilization that survived by assuming fragility rather than denying it, a culture that treated continuity as work rather than entitlement. This assumption shaped behavior at every level. Leaders restored rather than reinvented. Scribes copied rather than composed. Rituals repeated rather than evolved rapidly. Each choice limited risk. Each choice traded speed for resilience. Over time, such restraint can appear limiting. It constrains imagination. It slows transformation. Yet it also reduces catastrophic failure. The Sumerian world did not eliminate collapse, but it expected it and prepared for it. Modern civilization often does the opposite. It minimizes anticipation of collapse, framing it as anomaly rather than pattern. Recovery planning exists, but rarely at the level of foundational worldview. Stability is assumed until it breaks. The difference is subtle but profound. One worldview treats collapse as possible and prepares continuously. The other treats collapse as unthinkable and responds reactively. The Sumerian posture belongs to the first category. This posture does not require pessimism. It requires realism shaped by memory. Memory not as archive, but as orientation. A way of living that remembers vulnerability even during stability. The difficulty lies in sustaining such memory without constant disruption. When life proceeds smoothly, caution erodes. The very success of systems undermines the habits that keep them resilient. The Sumerian texts hint at this danger indirectly, through their relentless repetition. Repetition, in modern contexts, is often dismissed as stagnation. But repetition can be stabilizing when complexity exceeds understanding. It preserves function when explanation fails. It keeps systems aligned even when their origins are forgotten. This may explain why the Sumerian record feels so impersonal. Personal expression invites variation. Variation invites drift. Drift invites failure. The system prioritizes survival over expression. Modern sensibilities resist this trade-off. We value individuality, creativity, speed. These values drive innovation, but also amplify risk. When systems falter, the cost is often borne unevenly, revealing dependencies that were previously invisible. The ancient posture does not solve this tension. It simply frames it differently. It asks not how far we can go, but how long we can last. It replaces ambition with attentiveness. It measures success by continuity rather than expansion. This framing becomes increasingly relevant as modern systems approach thresholds of scale and complexity unknown to ancient societies. The question is no longer whether we can build more, but whether what we build can endure disruption. The Sumerian answer, embedded in practice rather than theory, suggests endurance depends on remembering limits, remembering that systems require care, remembering that knowledge decays, remembering that order is not self-sustaining. These reminders do not arrive as warnings, they arrive as posture, a way of moving through time slowly, deliberately, without assuming the future will resemble the present. The discomfort modern readers feel when encountering the Sumerian record may stem from this difference. The texts do not reassure, they do not celebrate progress, they do not promise permanence, they simply continue, as though continuity itself were fragile and precious. In this sense, the Sumerian legacy is not technological or theological. It is temperamental. It offers a tone rather than a doctrine, a quiet seriousness about survival. This tone is easy to miss because it lacks spectacle. It does not compete with louder narratives, yet it persists beneath them, surfacing whenever systems strain. As modern civilization faces its own thresholds, environmental, technological, social, the ancient restraint begins to feel less archaic. Questions once considered abstract return with urgency. How much complexity can be maintained? How much knowledge can be preserved? How quickly can systems adapt without breaking? The Sumerian record does not answer these questions directly. It predates them in their modern form, but it demonstrates a way of living that takes such questions seriously without dramatizing them. Its answer, if it can be called that, is not a solution, but a discipline, a commitment to repetition, maintenance and alignment, a refusal to confuse stability with inevitability. The clay tablets remain indifferent to whether this discipline is adopted or ignored. They do not seek relevance. They simply endure, carrying forward a memory of how one civilization learned to live inside uncertainty without pretending it could be eliminated. In that endurance lies their quiet challenge. Not to return to ancient practices, but to reconsider ancient assumptions. To ask whether progress without memory is sustainable, whether speed without restraint can endure. The Sumerian world does not stand as a model to be copied, it stands as a reminder. That civilization, at its core, is not an achievement secured once and for all, but a condition maintained through care. As this realization settles, the ancient record feels less distant. Its silence grows more resonant, its restraint less obscure. It begins to feel like a voice speaking across time, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, asking us to notice how easily continuity is mistaken for permanence. The clay does not insist, it waits, and in its waiting it leaves open a final reflection, that perhaps the greatest inheritance from the first civilization is not what it knew, but how carefully it behaved, as though it understood that everything worth preserving exists always on the edge of being lost. As the journey approaches its final stretch, the Sumerian record begins to feel less like an ancient artifact and more like a quiet presence, observing rather than instructing. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. What survives from the earliest civilization is not a declaration of greatness, but a posture toward fragility. The longer one lingers with these texts, the more they seem shaped by an understanding that stability is temporary and must be treated as such. This understanding does not manifest as fear, it manifests as attentiveness. The Sumerian world is not anxious in tone, it is careful, it moves deliberately, as though every action exists in relation to forces that cannot be fully controlled. Rivers shift, seasons misalign, memory thins. Writing appears not as triumph, but as response. What becomes striking at this stage is how little the texts insist on permanence. There is no promise that cities will last, no assurance that kingship will endure. Even the gods are not framed as eternal in the modern sense. They withdraw, diminish, transform. Everything is subject to change. The only constant is the effort to remain aligned. This effort shapes a civilization that values continuity without clinging to it. Restoration is pursued, but not idealized. When temples are rebuilt, they are rebuilt because function must resume, not because the past must be perfectly recreated. There is pragmatism here, an acceptance that what returns will not be identical to what was lost. Such acceptance suggests a deep familiarity with disappointment, not resignation, but realism. A culture that has experienced rupture learns to measure success differently. Survival itself becomes achievement. Continuity, however imperfect, becomes enough. This reframing alters how achievement is recorded. Monumental boasting is rare in the earliest layers. Accomplishments are noted briefly, often in relation to restoration rather than conquest. The emphasis remains on keeping the system intact, not expanding it beyond recognition. Later civilizations would invert this priority. Expansion would become proof of strength. Monumentality would become a language of power, yet with expansion comes exposure. Larger systems require more maintenance. When maintenance lags, collapse accelerates. The Sumerian restraint appears to anticipate this trade-off. By limiting ambition, it limits risk. By privileging balance, it resists overextension. This does not prevent decline forever, but it slows its onset, buying time for recovery. Time, once again, emerges as the silent focus. Not time as destiny, but time as pressure. Systems are given time to adapt because they are not pushed relentlessly toward growth. The pace of life aligns with environmental rhythms rather than abstract goals. This pacing contrasts sharply with modern expectations. Speed is equated with progress, slowness with inefficiency. Yet the Sumerian record suggests that slowness may be a form of intelligence when complexity is high and uncertainty persistent. The intelligence here is not analytical alone. It is embodied. It resides in habits, rituals, repetitions. Knowledge is not stored solely in texts, but in behavior. The culture knows how to act even when explanation fails. This embodied knowledge is difficult to recover once lost. It cannot be reconstructed fully from fragments. It requires continuity of practice. The Sumerians appear acutely aware of this. Their insistence on repetition keeps knowledge alive through doing. Modern societies often assume that documentation is sufficient, that instructions can replace experience. The Sumerian example quietly challenges this assumption. Writing supports memory, but does not substitute for lived alignment. As the ancient world gives way to later traditions, this embodied aspect thins. Text multiplies. Practice becomes abstracted. Ritual turns symbolic. The gap between knowing and doing widens. In moments of crisis, this gap becomes visible. Systems fail not because information is absent, but because coordination breaks down. The ancient emphasis on alignment, across domains, across roles, across time, appears suddenly relevant again. The Sumerian record does not anticipate modern crises. It simply models a way of living that expects crisis as part of existence. Its calm derives from this expectation. Surprise is minimized. Preparedness is normalized. This normalization of preparedness removes drama from survival. There is no heroism in maintaining canals, no glory in copying tablets, yet these acts sustain civilization more reliably than spectacle. The humility embedded in this approach is subtle. It does not deny human capacity. It situates it within limits. Humans matter because their actions affect balance. They are not exempt from consequence. This humility contrasts with later ideologies that place humanity at the center of meaning. In the Sumerian world, meaning arises from participation, not dominance. The universe does not revolve around human aspiration. Humans must learn to fit within it. Such a worldview does not inspire grand narratives of destiny. It inspires attentiveness, care, patience, qualities that are difficult to celebrate, yet essential to endurance. As modern readers approach the end of this long inquiry, the temptation arises to extract conclusions, to define what the Sumerians knew, to decide whether they remembered something older, lost, or hidden. The texts resist this impulse. They offer no final revelation, no secret unlocked. Their power lies in what they demonstrate, not what they declare. They show what it looks like when a civilization organizes itself around the assumption that loss is possible and forgetting is dangerous. This demonstration does not require speculative leaps. It is visible in structure, tone, repetition. The absence of origin stories, the focus on maintenance, the restraint in expression. Together, these form a coherent posture. Whether this posture emerged from a specific ancient catastrophe or from cumulative experience is ultimately less important than its effect. It produced a civilization that behaved as though survival were not guaranteed, even at its height. This behavior stands in quiet contrast to narratives that frame civilization as an irreversible ascent. The Sumerian record suggests a different image. Civilization as a balancing act, constantly adjusted, always vulnerable to imbalance. The image is not bleak. It is sober. It carries neither despair nor triumph, only attentiveness. A recognition that continuity is an achievement renewed daily, not a state secured once. As this understanding settles, the ancient world feels closer, not because it mirrors modern conditions exactly, but because it grapples with the same underlying tension: how to live with complexity without being undone by it. The Sumerians did not solve this tension permanently. Their civilization declined, as all do. But the way they lived within it left traces that still speak, quietly, through clay and silence. Those traces do not tell us what will happen next. They do not predict outcomes. They simply remind us of a posture that has appeared before whenever humans realize that what they depend on is more fragile than it seems. In this reminder lies the deepest resonance of the Sumerian record, not as proof of lost grandeur or hidden origins, but as evidence of a civilization that learned to live carefully, as though it understood that everything worth preserving exists on borrowed time. The tablets do not urge us to imitate them. They do not ask for reverence. They remain, uninsistent, bearing the imprint of a world that chose restraint over certainty, continuity over spectacle. As the long arc of this exploration nears its close, that choice begins to feel less distant, less ancient, less foreign. It begins to feel like a question carried quietly across millennia, waiting to be noticed again whenever the ground beneath civilization starts to feel less stable than assumed. As the final traces of this long reflection settle into silence, the Sumerian world no longer feels distant in time. It feels suspended, neither past nor present, but adjacent to every moment when certainty thins and continuity becomes an effort rather than an assumption. The clay tablets remain where they have always been, not speaking loudly, not demanding interpretation, simply holding their shape against erosion. What emerges at the end of this journey is not a revelation about origins, nor a secret history waiting to be decoded. It is something quieter and more unsettling, a recognition that the earliest written civilization behaved as though it understood how easily everything could be lost, not dramatically, not emotionally, but structurally. The absence that once felt mysterious now feels intentional. The missing beginnings, the restrained myths, the procedural tone. Together, they form not a puzzle, but a posture, a way of standing inside time that does not rely on confidence, destiny, or permanence, a way of living that assumes interruption and prepares for return. This posture reshapes how history itself appears. The past is no longer a straight line receding into darkness, but a surface repeatedly walked upon, worn down, rebuilt, and walked again. Civilization does not march forward triumphantly. It steadies itself, adjusts, and continues until it cannot. In this view, collapse is not failure, it is recurrence. Loss is not anomaly, it is condition. What matters is not whether disruption occurs, but whether enough alignment remains afterward to begin again without starting from nothing. The Sumerian texts feel composed by people who already knew this. Their restraint reads like experience distilled into habit. They do not argue against ambition. They simply do not center it. They do not deny meaning. They subordinate it to survival. This is why the record feels calm even when describing instability. The calm is not ignorance. It is familiarity. A familiarity earned through repetition rather than explanation. A knowledge that does not announce itself because it has already been lived. As modern civilization approaches its own thresholds of scale, speed, and interdependence, the ancient posture begins to resonate in unexpected ways. Not as instruction, not as warning, but as contrast. A different way complexity has been held before. The contrast is uncomfortable. It challenges the assumption that accumulation guarantees security. It questions whether more information always means more resilience. It suggests that systems grow fragile not when they are too small, but when they forget how carefully they must be maintained. The Sumerian world does not offer solutions to modern problems. It does not provide formulas, prophecies, or lost technologies. What it offers is orientation, a reminder that civilization has existed before under the shadow of forgetting, and responded not with spectacle, but with discipline. Discipline is difficult to romanticize. It does not inspire easily. It does not promise transcendence. It requires repetition, patience, and acceptance of limits. It asks for attention when distraction is easier, yet discipline is what survives when stories fail. When explanations collapse under complexity, when belief fragments, discipline endures because it does not depend on conviction. It depends on practice. The earliest civilization wrote as though it knew this. Its legacy is not the brilliance of its achievements, but the humility of its behavior. It did not assume it would be remembered. It prepared for the possibility that it would not. That preparation took form in clay, heavy, slow, resistant to change. Clay that could break, yes, but not evaporate. Clay that required effort to shape and effort to preserve. Memory made physical, but not eternal. There is something deeply human in this choice. To write not because one believes the future will listen, but because forgetting has consequences. To preserve not everything, but what is necessary to continue. At the end of this long arc, the question no longer feels like one of ancient mystery. It feels like a present condition. Not what the Sumerians knew, but what they assumed. Not what they hid, but what they prioritized. They prioritized alignment over explanation, continuity over confidence, maintenance over meaning. These priorities do not age well in periods of expansion. They fade when systems seem stable. They reappear only when stability reveals itself as illusion. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian record feels so quiet. It does not compete with louder narratives. It waits. It remains intact beneath layers of interpretation, ambition, and forgetting. The clay does not insist on relevance. It does not adapt itself to the present. It simply persists, offering the same posture to anyone willing to slow down enough to notice it. That posture does not resolve history into clarity. It leaves space for uncertainty, space for humility, space for the recognition that what feels foundational may already be inherited, and what feels permanent may already be fragile. As the last tablet settles back into the earth of thought, there is no conclusion to draw, no thesis to defend. Only an image remains. A civilization at the edge of memory, choosing carefully what to carry forward, not knowing how long it would last, not assuming it would be remembered, acting anyway. In that image lies a quiet continuity that stretches beyond dates, cultures, and interpretations. A reminder that history is not merely something that happens behind us, but something that waits beneath us, patient, silent, and ready to reappear whenever certainty gives way to care. The Sumerian record does not close this journey. It leaves it open, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition to be lived with. And perhaps that is its final presence. Not an answer preserved in clay, but a way of standing in time, aware that everything solid rests on layers that once broke, and may break again, yet still choosing to build with steadiness, restraint, and a memory deeper than words.